Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services Zoom News Conference. I'm Sandy Close, Director of EMS. Today's briefing focuses on sci-fi writers imagining alternative realities and futures, a booming genre across the world. An increasingly racially and ethnically diverse field of writers, both in the US and abroad, are using fiction, speculative, science, fantasy to reimagine their world and their future, as well as complex problems like climate change, the legacies of colonialism and globalization, violence against women, inequality, and other issues. A panel of writers and experts discuss how fiction genres that used to be identified with aliens, spaceships, and monsters, coming out mainly from a Western, white, male perspective, with some exceptions, have become a popular way to deal with or react to world realities. Our speakers include Ericka A. Hoagland, Associate Professor and Coordinator of Graduate Studies, English and Creative Writing, Stephen F. Austin State University, co-author of Science Fiction, Imperialism, and the Third World. Livia Brenda, writer, editor, and translator based in Mexico City, Climate Imagination Fellow with the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. Ken Liu, American author of speculative fiction, winner of the Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Awards, winner of top genre honors in Japan, Spain, and France. Samit Basu, Indian novelist and filmmaker whose body of work includes science fiction, fantasy, and superhero novels, children's books, graphic novels, short stories, and nonfiction. Isis Asari, whom we were waiting to have join us and hope she will.
She's on.
Great. CEO, founder of Sista Sci-Fi, first Black-owned bookstore focused on science fiction and fantasy in the US, validated by the American Booksellers Association. Speakers, we ask you to speak slowly, as I'm doing, so our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean can keep up with you. And we ask reporters, enter your questions for these wonderful panelists in the chat, and we will address following each speaker as time allows. Our speakers are also encouraged to answer questions throughout the conference in the chat, and we'll be sending a video of today's briefing with expanded bios and contact information for each speaker to all participants. Now, let me turn this over. We've been talking about and really anticipating today's panel for weeks. And thank you, Pilar, for putting this panel together, our associate editor at EMS.
Thank you, Sandy. I am incredibly excited. I don't remember being this excited about a briefing in recent times. This has just been fascinating. I've been learning a lot. I knew next to nothing about science fiction, and now, thanks to our panelists, I know a bit more. So let's go right into it. And I'm going to start with Professor Hoagland, Professor Ericka Hoagland, because she was the first person that I talked to, the first person that agreed to be on the panel, and she told me a big deal about these genres. So Ericka, welcome so much. So I'm just going to go right to the point. When we talked, you said that your background in post-colonial literature and theory, and then that science fiction is a really good vehicle for exploring the ongoing legacy of colonialism and its new manifestations like globalization, climate change, civil wars, economic interdependency of various nations, etc. These are your words. So can you talk a little bit about that, just 2 minutes if you can. I know it's a lot to talk about in 2 minutes, but try to keep it there.
Well, I think the best way for me to connect to some of those larger, more kind of sweeping observations is to connect to a few stories. I was thinking about how to connect to some stories that I share with my own students in the classroom to help them better appreciate the way, especially science fiction is being marshaled or mobilized to really talk about the things that they're reading about and hearing about in the news cycle and that they see impacting the world they inhabit. And so I think I'm going to connect to a couple of stories that I've recently shared with my students. One is this really fantastic story, short story by the Indian science fiction writer. She also happens to be a physicist teaching here in the States, Vandana Singh. Her story, Mother Ocean, which is just a beautifully crafted story that is set in a future point in Earth's, potential future, where the ocean levels have risen significantly, displacing millions of people, including the tribal community of the protagonist. And she ends up developing a friendship, a connection with one of the remaining blue whales on the planet that has become trapped with these, I can't remember, fiber optic meshing that's been in the ocean, and it's caught in all of its teeth. And she helps to get rid of this meshing and saves the whale's life. But more importantly, she learns to speak the whale's language. She develops a way to communicate with the whale. And in thinking about the ways that these stories this story as an example is starting to look to possible futures, to look at science fiction beyond that kind of stereotype of space travel and space conquest, and looking at it instead as very localized, regionalized, tapping into communities and how they experience the world right now. What happens in this story when she learns that language, to me, it really communicates that we need to learn nature's language and stop forcing nature to speak our language if we're going to have any hope of saving ourselves and protecting the planet. And another good example, I think, of the ways that writers that, years ago would have seemed to not fit with this stereotypical idea of science fiction as very masculine, Western, all of those things. Nnedi Okorafor is this fantastic writer, Nigerian-American writer, and her short story, Spider the Artist, is another story that I share with my students because it allows them to connect with something that they probably don't know about, which is what's happening in the Nigerian Delta, the massive ecological damage that's being done because of the oil reserves there. And in a similar way, the protagonist in that story befriends a creature, in this case, an AI built like a spider that has been sent to protect the pipeline running through her village. And they find a mutual connection through music. And again, it's just interesting that both of those stories are pushing a message, promoting a message about we need to look at things differently if we're going to find a way out of the present that the past has brought us to. We need to look at the past differently, and we need to move forward in ways that I think hold us more accountable for our actions. And I've noticed that a lot in the science fiction that I've been sharing with my students. So that's, for me, that's the way to come back to your question, is rather than focus on these larger things, these stories, I think offer a good example.
That was excellent. Made it very easy to understand. The other thing we talked about was the increasing diversity of writers. With more women writers, more writers of color. And you said to me something like 100 years ago, science fiction was a white male space, a boy club. How has it opened up, and why?
Well, again, that's my quick way of, in one respect, just explaining my own perception. When I was much younger and thinking about science fiction, I thought of it in, again, a rather stereotypical way that wasn't entirely removed from reality, obviously, because if we think especially about American science fiction in mid 20th century, it was very much exclusive and exclusionary in terms of the writers that were being actively published and promoted. And there were lots of writers, women writers, and writers of color that were not getting platforms for their writing. This took some time because there were gatekeepers like John Campbell, who were not promoting and publishing writers, but they were there. And I think it was a matter of just changing sensibilities. It took time, obviously, and it's still a process where we're seeing more writers. It's not that they weren't there, that they weren't writing. It's just that their visibility and their access to being published and being promoted wasn't there for quite a while. But I think that perception of science fiction, whether it's as a boys' club, which again was sort of how I entered the world in a sense with science fiction when I was a teenager, that's certainly been modified as I've encountered more stories, and I'm still learning every day just how deep this history, this very diverse history of science fiction actually runs. I think what the larger perception may still be is that there's sort of like Chimamanda Adichie talks about that single story. There's this sort of single story about science fiction that says it's escapist entertainment. It's more kind of a juvenile sort of literature or genre, and it's only focused on the West. But I think that these stories that are gaining more visibility, when we see a writer like N.K. Jemisin winning the Hugo 3 times in a row, we're seeing a really clear shift in what audiences want to read and what they want to support. And the writers that are starting to remold science fiction in, I think, fundamentally beautiful and important ways that are helping science fiction itself to progress as a genre.
Okay, thank you so much, Ericka. Stay around. I'm going to move on to our next panelist. Okay, sure. Good. Livia, I'm going to invite you to speak now. You're in Mexico, and Mexico City, right? But the one thing, apart from, reading a wonderful article about science fiction in Mexico that you wrote that called my attention was that you are a climate imagination fellow. I thought that was so brilliant. With the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. What a great name for a center. And you talked to me about some work that you have done, and also, with the center, but also with some other Mexican women writers about a volcano, a story about a volcano. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I really like that piece that you talked to me about.
Yeah, the people from the Center of Science and the Imagination, which the name, it's adorable. I really love it. They contacted me and they invited me to this fellowship with Vandana Singh, with Hannah Onoguye, who is based on, I don't remember right now which place in Africa, and now Gushi, who is from China. The 4 of us were invited. And when they invited me, I was very surprised. I was like, oh my God, it's really me? Who are you looking for? But also, after some thought, I invited more people to come with me, and I proposed the people from the center, from the fellowship, if I could collaborate with other writers and some scientists, because I am part of some collectives here in Mexico that we made science fiction, we made fantastic literature, we organized panels. We have a lot of work related to science fiction, and also in a particular case, science fiction and science. And the people from the center, they were like, okay, if you want to, then you have to deal with all the people and you just bring us the texts. And I was like, of course. So what we did was 5 writers, we made the world building, and the point is the Iztaccíhuatl, which is one of the volcanoes that are in the middle of the country. There is like a volcano chain, and this volcano, the Iztaccíhuatl, it's like the second. I'm sorry. The 2 minutes. The 2 minutes just ended.
Keep going. Keep going. Don't worry about that.
So
tell us about the story.
We said the story in 2025, and then some decades in the future, and in the future, and in the future, and each of us made a little piece. So there is like a narrative arc that connects all the stories, and the setting is that a volcano erupts, which is some due to some climate change factors, and that provokes a big changes in the atmosphere and in the ecosystems. So we are imagining how we are going to live after something like that. That is like very like it's a probability here in Mexico. So we have been writing, and we have been consulting with scientists, and we have been one of us is an artist, and she has been making some drawings, and it's a collective effort. And in the future, that is going to be translated. Actually, it's already translated now, and they are going to publish it. And it's a collective story, so it's an experiment in many ways, and it's a science fiction based story.
But let me ask you this, Livia. When we spoke, you said, what we do in Latin America is really nothing to do with what's going on in the US in terms of science fiction. We write about our own realities here, like you just described. And you referenced Argentina with, past dictatorships, you referenced Mexico, and, the assassination of women, for example. And you told me about this work. It's not your work, but it's something that you referenced that deals with women that have been assassinated. It's called Soñarán en el Jardín, to dream in the garden. So how does Mexico imagine? How does Mexico's writers imagine a Mexico where women are not assassinated, where there's no narco trafficking? How do you do that?
Well, in the first place, I think in Mexico and in general in Latin America, we have our own thing going on, and the tradition, it's like rooted in Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who was a poet from the 17th century. I think I'm saying that right. She already wrote something imagining like an astral traveling. So if Mary Shelley is the mother of science fiction with Frankenstein, over here, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, it's like our great-great-grandmother. So we have been doing things on our own, imagining futures, imagining space traveling, and also from 20th century to now, we have been reading, especially United States science fiction. So there is a mixture, there is a lot of hybridation, there is a lot of imagination that goes, it's rooted in our own traditions and the indigenous people that lived here way before us. And let's not forget, we are the product of colonization. And that is very important because that confuses us, but also give us like a landscape very rich and full of contradictions, political contradictions, economical contradictions, cultural contradictions. The fact that I am speaking in English is part of that colonization in cultural in terms of culture. So in Mexico, when we imagine a future, sometimes we are, especially women, authors that are young and that are women, we are kind of tired of the dystopian futures, and we are fed up with the male, super vertical, super masculine, super commercial science fiction. So we try to imagine based on hope. we are not imagining a world that is impossible. We are imagining a world that is the product of a change. So I think that is one of the main focuses. And an author like Gabriela Damián Mirabete, who is the author of They Will Dream in the Garden, that was the recipient of the Otherwise Award, that at the moment was the last James Tiptree Junior Award. She is one of the main, the most important voices about hope and about a science fiction that is not Occidental, masculine, super technological. And it's important because we come from a tradition that is not just similar to the tradition from the United States, but it's a mixture of a lot of different elements, including movies. Like we consume a lot of culture from English countries, especially United States, and we are neighbors. So all of that influences our writing, but we are trying to go beyond like the obvious, and we are also trying to imagine a world in which we can build a different kind of landscape, a world that is the capitalism is a problem. Even in the literature, we have to decenter the fiction, and we have to stop being so anthropocentric. If we are going to write something different, we have to, as Ericka has said, we have to like focus in different things and in different voices and in different origins, I think. Hope I responded the question.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to move to the next panelist. Thank you so much. Stay around. Okay, Ken, you're up. Ken Liu, how are you? Welcome. I'm going to give you a broad question. How do you use your writing to pursue your interests and to imagine or reimagine our world? You're muted.
Thank you. So that's a great question. So just to give a little bit of a background to contextualize what I'm about to say, I have an overriding concern with technology and interest in technology, and that sort of guides a lot of my thinking. In some ways, I think the genre science fiction is misnamed. The vast majority of science fiction has almost nothing to do with science. The vast majority of science fiction are really fiction about technology. So, tech-fi might be a better name for it than sci-fi. So what is the distinction between science and technology? Well, it's commonly thought of as science is this sort of higher abstract, nobler pursuit, and technology is nothing more than the application of scientific insights. Nothing can be further from the truth. Often technology races way ahead of science. Technology is an art. It's about our attempt, the human attempt to make mental structures tangible. So I say that it's not possible to understand human nature unless you understand human technology, in the same way that it is not possible to understand beavers without understanding their dams, or honeybees without understanding beehives. Human craft is nothing more than the physical, tangible manifestation of human mental patterns. And if you wish to understand human nature, you must understand human technology. And often technology races way ahead of science. We're witnessing that right now. Almost no theoretician of artificial intelligence predicted that the current approach of large language models will yield results as wonderful as they have been. In fact, most of the practitioners would concede that they do not understand how things like ChatGPT are able to do what they do. It's actually a mystery. This is an example of technology being ahead of the science. Often scientific principles are discovered by studying technological innovations where we do something and we don't actually understand how it's done. Okay, that aside, I am deeply interested in technology, broadly understood, and how it can alter the way we think and construct the future. Technology, I don't mean just machines. I mean things like custom. I mean things like ideology. I mean stories that we tell each other and to remind ourselves of who we are. These are all technology because, as I said, technology is just the manifestation of human mental patterns in the world. So that includes custom, that includes calendars, that includes maps, that includes methods and approaches to governance, to capitalism, as we spoke about. Capitalism itself is a form of technology. It does not exist on its own. It's a human invention. It's a form of human craft. So I like to think about technology, and a lot of my work is motivated by the concern that we have a monoculture in technology, in modernity. So I travel around the world quite a bit, and I speak to a lot of folks from all around the world in different cultures. And one common refrain I hear is a sense of not feeling entirely at home in modernity. Most of people who feel this way are people who have been marginalized in various ways from modernity, whether they're colonized, whether they have gender or sexual orientation and gender identities, cultural affinities, etc., that are excluded from being able to declare that they are the inventors of modernity. Okay, so I speak to a lot of people who say, you know, I have to go to school and learn about science and politics in English. And then when I speak about them in my own indigenous language, I have to use translated terms that reflect the mental patterns and experiences of people, not my own. I feel like my own culture is merely preserved. And the very term of preservation implies that it's no longer alive and no longer a living part of modernity. And that struck me as deeply important and deeply relevant. You know, we have a modernity that is largely constructed by a small group of people who have imposed their view on the rest of the world. And so we have a set of technologies, literally, with which we're supposed to reimagine the future. Even the very language we use of science fiction is restrictive because, you know, different cultures have been imagining the future in all sorts of ways, but only if you speak and write in a certain way would your stories be considered science fiction. And we need to think about why that is. Why is it that certain stories are deemed mythology and merely folktale, and other stories are deemed science fiction? It's, you know, these genre boundaries are arbitrary, and they are imposed to validate a particular view of how technology ought to be used and wielded, and what is a proper form of technology. So a lot of my work can be described as punk work of various kinds. You know, one of the genres I'm supposedly invented is called soak punk, and oftentimes people use the punk suffix without thinking about what that actually means. Punk is very important to me because punk is about not respecting what is already there and saying that I don't really care what you think the boundaries are. I'm just going to defy it and do things the way I want to. I'm going to take something that is declared to be for a different purpose, and I will use it for a new purpose. I do not care what you think. That's sort of the core attitude of punkness. Soap punk is my attempt to sort of reinvent and reimagine modernity using alternative technologies. So for example, oftentimes when we speak about indigenous or so-called, you know, non-Western philosophy, we speak of them as though they are not relevant in modernity. They are just alternative ways in the past, not relevant. Well, why? Why is that even deemed, you know, necessary? Techno-shamanism is a growing movement where we're trying to reinterpret and reintegrate traditional indigenous ways of knowing into modernity as a core part of living modernity, not merely something to be preserved. So punk involves a lot of my attempt as a technologist and as a thinker to reimagine and punkify traditional East Asian technologies, broadly understood, which includes philosophies, actual engineering, political philosophy, etc., and trying to imagine how they can be part of the constitution of modernity and for the future. A lot of times we simply concede that there is a thing as literature, and then there's diverse literature. and we can see that there's science fiction and then diverse science fiction. I dislike that kind of framing because it implies that what is already there is somehow definitive, somehow the platonic ideal to which others are supposed to aspire to. I simply disagree. It's much more interesting to me to say that science fiction as we have it is merely one form of science fiction. We are now simply seeing the fulfillment of what largely understood science fiction can be if we punkify the genre and bring all indigenous traditions and cultures and voices and all alternative. No, I don't even like alternative because that term again implies somehow what is already there is definitive. All perspectives should be included in telling this ongoing story. And I view myself as part of that effort.
Punkify, I like that. Thank you so much. I am going to move on to the next panelist, but stay around. We want to talk more. I'm going to go to Isis Azari. She's the CEO and founder of Sci-Fi, and she's been having a super interesting conversation in the chat with Julia, one of our journalists. But Isis, welcome. Thank you for being with us. When we first talked, I don't know if I can see you. Hold on. Where are you? Oh, there you are. You're in one of the. Okay. When we first talked, you quoted to me from the words of Octavia Butler, probably the best known African-American science fiction writer. And by the way, she was from my backyard here in California. And she was from Pasadena, a pretty racist and class divided town at the time. You said that she said science fiction is a place where she felt free as marginalized people. Free as marginalized people, we have to write ourselves in. Can you pick up on that and tell us how you see these genres, speculative fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, from an African-American point of view, from your point of view, as someone who's promoting the work of many writers?
Yeah, gladly. But I'm really happy to be here today. I mean, I'm learning a lot from the other panelists. So the quote from Octavia Butler, because I was paraphrasing, is, I was attracted to science fiction because it was so wide open. I was able to do anything, and there were no walls to hem you in. There was no human condition where you were stopped from examining. And when I read that quote, as a Black woman, as a queer person, you know, in the US, where like it feels like there are constantly so many constraints, it's just like a magnet to science fiction, where I can like drop the constraints of class or limit, like dealing with chauvinism, and really explore. For a lot of science fiction writers, in my experience, particularly for science fiction readers, it's less about escapism and it's more about the chance to develop practices and to look at themes to reignite your imagination, and like a world that is constantly telling you like there's no space for that, or this is what is and this is only what is. I think a lot of the times, in my experience as a marginalized person, that is the first thing that oppression does. It clamps your ability to like imagine and dream and to pursue something bigger. So I think that's why Octavia Butler was attracted to the genre.
Talk to us a little bit as someone who has studied literature, who has some stores. You had an online store, and you now have, I love this, vending machines that sell books. So talk to us about some of the genres. You know, the thing that I've heard most about in my ignorance is Afrofuturism. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, so Sister Sci-Fi is located in cyberspace. And in February, we launched our first 3 Sister Sci-Fi book vending machines. And in the midst of all of that, I feel like Sister Sci-Fi sits in that intersection of Afrofuturism, which is definitely a buzz. Julia's talking about it in the chat. Afrofuturism is a term that was coined in the early 80s by a white writer and journalist to describe an aesthetic across medium. Writer and activist Yatasha Womack describes Afrofuturism as the intersection of imagination, technology, future, and liberation, where literature, visual arts, music, grassroots organization redefine cultural notions of Blackness. And that definition, it's less about technology and less about the future. My personal definition of Afrofuturism is the intersection of African diaspora culture, and I say that versus African American to mean Black people here in the US, Black people on the continent, in the Caribbean, in Europe, in Asia, regardless of where you are at, that are connected to core African traditions, the merging of that in science and technology. I love Ken's differentiation of the two. I tend to use the two interchangeably, so now I'm rethinking that. And really taking that intersection and bringing that into the future, because I personally love more technology than science. I love technology and I love imagining visionings of the future. My definition, however, excludes mysticism, it excludes fantasy, it excludes folklore, and Yatasha's definition would include all those genres.
Your comment on the chat to Julia, I just want you to talk about this. Wakanda is to Afrofuturism as Blackula is to Blaxploitation. Please talk about that.
Okay. I was hoping I could just slide that under the radar. So Black Panther and the commercial success of that really allowed people to question what is this? What is this greater genre? What is Afrofuturism? And we're beginning to see several more museum exhibitions about it, lots more books and literatures about it. So one just came out this week, Afrofuturism, A History of Black Futures. It's a companion book to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC. Their year-long exhibition of Afrofuturism, which opens today. So if you're in DC, check it out. I'm in Oakland, California, but I will be traveling to DC in May to check out that exhibition. And it's really taking Afrofuturism front and center in several different mediums. So literature, music, arts, visual arts, movies, television, which to me is really exciting because looking at Black literature historically, there's a lot of concentration in urban fiction. There's a lot of concentration in celebrity biographies, but there wasn't a lot of focus on Black speculative fiction. And when you got examples of that, it wasn't labeled as such. Like when you read some works by Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, there are definitely aspects of speculative fiction, but they're just not discussed in that way. So I really feel that Black Panther is starting a movement in much the same way, and it's a really odd parallel. Blackula was actually one of the first Blaxploitation films, right? We like to think of Foxy Brown and Chef, but it actually started with Blackula, which was a reclamation of a very white Eurocentric, folklore, and set in the modern day with, a Black leading character, and really infuses African culture. The person who would become Blackula was an African prince who was talking to Blackula, we have to end the slave trade. So it's a really big part of that theme. And it started a cultural movement. So that's why I say that Black Panther is the Afrofuturism as
We lost your audio.
I accidentally muted the
you muted
Blaxploitation
yourself.
movement. Yeah.
All right.
And today you can see a lot of museum exhibitions about the Blaxploitation movement as well.
Thank you, Isis. I'm going to move on to Samit Basu. Is it Basu or Basu? Samit, forgive me.
Either works for me.
Okay. He's calling in from Delhi, so it's pretty late there. I was thrilled when you accepted the invitation, because from what I've read about your book, The City Inside, this is a sci-fi book based on very real concerns, very real news in your city of Delhi. And it turned out to be really popular not just in India, but beyond it. Tell us about what drove you to write this book. You said you wanted it to be as real as possible, but it is science fiction. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and I mean, with science fiction, for example, I love what Ken said about distinction between technology and science, and the different ways we look at the speculative genres around the world. So this book started from essentially my own concerns about the future in living in a country that is like the rest of the world in many ways, facing multiple apocalypses on a daily basis, on an ever shifting cycle. And so I wanted to write a near future book that looked at, the various filters of reality that we're living in, not with the order of, say, a Black Mirror episode, which looks at one filter at a time, and a crisis arrives and people deal with it. But the real world experience of living in an age of permanent surveillance and permanent distraction, where everything is mashed together, where it's everything everywhere all at once, but it's not really a comedy except from the outside. So I live in a part of the world where I'm writing a book where I'm hoping to capture everyday reality, but everyone who's reading it says it's a dystopia, right? So which was not my intention at all, which led me to realize that dystopia is a function of distance. So my everyday reality, which I'm living in, looks to people reading from elsewhere in the world as a complaint of a sort, because that distance, where my everyday mess is your harsh examination of how terrible the world is. And this has been a source of constant kind of joy, confusion, and delight over the last 2 decades of writing in the speculative genres. Because, I think that culture as a whole, and especially the last 2 decades, have shown us that, all the stereotypes and all the kind of the narrowing downs of people from the West or the East are like this, have in a post broadband and post streaming and post multimedia world proved to be it's not that they're completely false, but it's like the way that they were seen was one of 100 different ways where we could look at the intersections of cultures. So every large country, for instance, is incredibly diverse within itself. It's incredibly multi-layered within itself. And just engaging with American science fiction and American fantasy over the last decade alone has taught me so much more about the vast differences within America that we never saw from the other half of the planet. So what I found fascinating about when my book traveled to America, right, was that I was looking at a fragmented, multi-layered, very diverse culture in my own country, but because all over the world, we're essentially dealing with the same problems. We're dealing with the same problems, but the specific local settings of those problems are dependent on the local cultures where people are experiencing them. But the various competing monocultures that we're all dealing with in a world where where communication and technology are distributed incredibly unequally and incredibly diversely to various segments of society, but they are the same things. So I found that, for readers in America, for example, it was a lot of the response was, this is a very scary depiction of a very plausible future. And I was personally very surprised that the fact that it was set in Delhi wasn't as big a barrier as I thought it would be. With regard to kind of science fiction and fantasy in general, I mean, thanks to cultural stereotyping, I've always found that there's a certain kind of books that Indians were expected to write in the 90s and the 2000s, the sort of, literary fiction with a magic realist sensibility that's broadly culture explainy. I turned to SF and fantasy because I thought they would give me more freedom. When I encountered publishing culture in the US and the UK, I was a bit shocked to find that it was mostly one of constraints. That working in genre was actually more limiting, not less, in ways that I found very surprising. And you know, especially with regard to, say, what Ken was saying earlier about punk, right? The fact that punk reaches India as a product of the capitalist system after it has achieved mainstream success and is then filtered down to us, shorn of every form of rebellion and difference, as a hit that we should engage with as a powerful part of the Western mainstream, is hilarious, I think, because for me, when work is traveling the other way, it's like filling in a visa form. My imagination or my perception of reality has to be shaped into boxes that I wasn't aware existed and are not necessary. I don't want to go on too long about this, so I'll stop here, but that's where I was.
Okay. All right, sounds good. I'm gonna put my boss on the spot, Sandy. I'm dying for a question from you, for these writers and for these experts.
I want to go to a bookstore right away. Being high touch, I want to put my hands on some of this literature. I'm intrigued to want to ask each of you to ask each other a question. I would love Ken to ask a question of Livia. I would love Livia to ask a question of, and if you see what I mean, because you are so far ahead of us in this whole new novel way. First of
You
all,
to us.
first time I've ever heard technology defined in a way that makes me want to like it. I've always seen it as sort of my enemy. I can't deal with this digital world, but now you're making me want to like it. So
Isis, she raised her hand, so I guess she wants to.
Okay,
She wants to go.
great. Okay.
Isis, you want to ask a question from anyone? Oh, what happened? Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted.
I was, yes, sorry, but I didn't want to interrupt Sandy. So Sandy, if you were still.
Well,
That's okay. That's okay.
So then my question is for Livia. You talked about the collaborative nature of how you made the fellowship for the center collaborative. And when you said that, I was like, that makes sense to me. As a Black woman, if I had a project, there's a 90% chance I will make it collaborative. Do you think as, and I'm making assumptions about your identity, but as a woman of color, that's why you decided to make the project collaborative?
Basically, I was a little bit scared because I am not, I don't even really write in English. I have to write in Spanish and then get translated. And this invitation was a surprise to me. And first of all, I wanted to share this opportunity. And I also wanted to work with the people I usually work in a collaborative way, because when I personally discovered a collaborative way of working, I was like, this is a new life for me. There is no going back, you know? So this is people who I have been written for years and collaborating and thinking. So it was like a very natural step. But I think for many people that can be strange or unusual, even here in Mexico. But I also think that is one of the principal ways in which we are going to survive together and as collectives, different types of collectives and different types of groups of people. So the individualistic perception of writing has to be hacked. You know, we have to take down this marble tower in which there is just one individual on the top having all the success. It's like we are part of a collective. Without people, without other people, we could not survive. So as writers, we also need to do that. So it was like a lot of components, personal and also intellectual. But thank you for your question, Isis. It's yeah, it was some of that. I am Mexican and I am representing Mexico in this fellowship, so it was a lot of responsibility, and I can also share that, and that it's like a relief also.
Thank you, Livia. Ken and Samit, I'm just intrigued. What would you ask of each other? You guys have met
Oh, I want to
before.
go.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question. Like,
Go for it.
Samit, I loved what you said. It was so thoughtful, so great, a great way to capture a lot of the thoughts that were in my head, but I couldn't quite articulate. So that was awesome. I really hope we get opportunities to discuss more in the future. The question I want to ask you is your metaphor of, what it's like when you were trying to publish in the Anglo-American market. It was like, the visa process, you got to check a box. That resonates with me because I've applied for visas to other countries, and it really is ridiculous. You can see how the bureaucrats imagine the world. There are these boxes. You must fit into one of these boxes. If you don't neatly fit into them, you don't know what to do. What are some things you can imagine that we can do in the writing and reading community here in the Anglo-American world to make that process easier and better and not so restrictive?
And I mean, first of all, to boil it down, I don't have an answer, but broadly speaking, my gut feel on this is that it's not the reading and writing people who are the problem at all. Because, when a work travels anywhere to anyone, people mostly read it with an open mind. Often they don't, but there is always the possibility that they will. People who don't have genre preconceptions, and again, just even locally, that's been a fascinating process, because since we don't have any genre stereotypes in this part of the world, because genre is not seen as a box, but as a broad description of what kind of work it is, the demographics of people who read genre are completely not what anyone would expect anywhere in the world. So when we're looking at what one might loosely call an international, reading exchange, I think a lot of the process is to eliminate the kind of the middle men who have this kind of, who bring in these definitions, which bring in an inertia which just slows down communication and causes signal loss. And I mean, just to kind of add to this, I have a counter question for you, really, because
Go for it.
As I was telling you, I'm a big fan, as you know, and it's been so interesting reading your work, not just as an author, but also as a translator, because it's been fascinating watching, reading. I read all of it in English, of course, but I wanted to ask you, as someone who's traveling the world and who's kind of facing the challenges of bringing work from China to the US and elsewhere, wherever the English reading people are, what are the specific challenges of that? Because there are so many cultural fragmentations and so many overlaps, and yet so many differences. How do you approach that process? Like, how does your powerful brain deal with it?
So, to me, that's a great question, and I'm gonna have to sort of steal from you by saying upfront that I don't have an answer. And in fact, I can't really address the translation aspect at all, mainly because I've found overall that I have a pretty strong opinion that translators who are translating from communities of less power to communities of greater prestige generally should not act as spokespersons. And the reason why I feel that way is because it contributes to this idea, especially because of my own identity as an American, it contributes to the idea that Americans of Chinese descent are somehow indistinguishable from Chinese writers, and that we are actually able to speak for them, which I'm incredibly against, and I definitely want to correct that. And so I also think it's disrespectful in some sense for one author to speak on behalf of another. And because I respect my friends so much, I don't want to speak on their behalf. I did the translations as a work of love. And for me to speak on their behalf about their work would be deeply disrespectful. So having said all of that, I want to address the part of the question, which is about, the sort of thing that you talked about, which is when you're writing about stories that don't necessarily fit into the existing cultural conversation, what are you supposed to do? A lot of my work is explicitly aimed at changing, or back to that old word, punkifying the very conception of what it means to be XYZ. I make a conscious effort, for example, to say that I identify as an American writer. I do that explicitly because if I don't do that, there's a very high tendency for people to exclude me from the American mainstream by saying, oh, he's just some Chinese person. And I refuse to let that happen. So, I go to international festivals, and when I say, well, this is my view as an American, and oftentimes when I'm in Europe or something, there will be readers who will be like, but you don't look like an American. It's extremely, it is what it is. It's something that I have to deal with. But my very existence and the fact that I refuse to concede to that sort of thing, and I refuse to be excluded. If people want to have in their minds the Chinese Exclusion Act, that's their problem. I'm not going to let them be comfortable doing that. I will insist on claiming the American voice and speak as an American. And I hope all those who wish to punkify the world will, do as I do and not let them do that. So, a lot of times I write these stories and people will ask me, oh, so this is a story about cultural conflict. And I say, nope, that's not what it is about. It's about systemic racism. The fact that you classify my character as Chinese as opposed to American is part of the problem. A lot of times when I do this, what I'm saying is Mandarin is an American language, and these stories about Guan Yu are American stories. That is actually the entire point of why I construct the story this way. And if you don't see that, the problem is you, not me.
I love that. Thank you.
We need to close. However, I just had Sandy text me something about AI, and I'm just thinking, how do you feel about AI? I know journalists are very scared about AI. We've already been decimated enough. Our jobs are fewer and fewer. We have to write short story, like very short. Do writers like you fear AI just replacing you? And anyone can join in to close, because we are about to hit the hour. Anyone?
No, no, I think there are millions of tools, and the tools change and we change the use of those tools, but I don't see why a tool is going to replace us. It's a very short answer, but I don't know the rest of you. Ken, you are very keen to technology. What are your thoughts on
And he
that?
talked about AI a little bit, yeah.
I would just say one quick thing. I think it's kind of interesting how the way we talk about these large language models now, we all sort of act as though the machines are thinking and it's terrifying, etc. There are two observations I want to make. One is that the wonders and successes of ChatGPT and Bard and the rest of them is really a reflection of the amazing wonders of our collective linguistic output. It's not the technology that is amazing to me, is the fact that all of us, all of humanity, have put our linguistic output out there on the internet. And this body of work can be now statistically treated to generate answers to questions. ChatGPT doesn't know anything. It just knows our collective linguistic output and is able to answer questions based on that. I mean, so that means we have externalized our minds into this body of output. That is incredible. It's fantastic. It's magical. That part I'm amazed by. It's a really wonderful acknowledgement of our own wonder as a species. The other thing I want to say about art and AI is that I'm far more interested in AI that's capable of giving us a view of reality that is not human intelligence based. Right now, all of these AI efforts are largely just efforts to recreate and replicate what humans can say and do. It's just the imitation game that Turing proposed that we're continuing. I'm not particularly interested in this. I don't particularly care about having the AI able to imitate human. It just doesn't interest me. I'm much more interested in an AI that is able to give me a perspective that no one else can see. And I saw a question from the chat that I just want to quickly address. Somebody asked the question, perhaps be provocative, how is Mandarin an American language? In the same way Spanish is an American language, in the same way Vietnamese is an American language, in the same way all those who claim to be American, whatever language they speak, is by definition an American language. We have never been here in the US an English-only country, and thank God.
I'll say amen to that. We can take another minute to ask the others to say something. Isis and Professor, you've been so quiet listening to all these folks. Professor Hoagland, anyone, please just, I don't know, let's start with you, Ericka. Say something to end, or did you learn something incredible here today?
That's exactly right. Yes. I really was just kind of listening to everyone this afternoon, kind of from my position as, being in the classroom, when I get the opportunity to teach science fiction, I'm wanting to help my students branch out beyond what their expectation might have been about the sorts of texts that we might read. And so this panel has been a really lovely way for me to just, again, continue along that path, because I think it's the right path that I want them to be on for thinking about what kind of incredible stories that we can create when we open up this genre in terms of what it is. And so that's been for me a real benefit of just sitting and listening to everyone speak this afternoon, is just hearing about that.
Thank you. Isis?
Yeah, totally agree. So since there was a lot of conversation and questions about Afrofuturism and Black Panther, if you want more media in this space, Netflix is launching African folktales and reimagined short stories, so you get more cultural context. And some of the themes that you saw in Black Panther, there's also Neptune Frost, which is an Afrofuturist independent film by Saul Williams, which is set in a fictional Southern African country. It's all in English subtitles. It might be difficult to find that to watch, but I dropped the links in the chat if you want to learn more. I learned so much. So thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Samit?
Oh yeah, I just want to say thank you for having me. I was so excited to join, and I'm even more excited just having heard everyone speak. So yeah, I was just very happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Livia, last words?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this conversation. And I learned a lot, actually. So hopefully there is more Latin American and Spanish sci-fi written, translated to English,
Yes.
or you could all learn Spanish. It's not that difficult. You just have to open more. You just have to open your mouth.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Ken?
It's been a real pleasure to speak with all of you and to learn from you. It was really cool. I love this conversation, and I hope that I get opportunities to speak with all of you more in the future. This was really wonderful.
Agreed. And I know we're at time, but this is something I was about to say, and then Frank said it in the chat. There isn't Native American representation on the panel. Great authors in that space are Rebecca Ronhorst and Cherry Dolomé. There's Darcy Little Badger, whose work crosses both literature, and a lot of them have written for television shows. So yeah, that is something that we didn't get to speak to today, but there are a lot of the space.
We'll have to follow up. We're going to do a series of articles as well, so I'll follow up on that, okay? We'll do that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I'm so thankful to everyone that called in from all over the place. I'm really excited that this came out the way it did. It was wonderful. Sandy, I don't know if you want to say hi, bye, something.
No, I just very inspired by the speakers and by our wonderful media colleagues who give us this platform to explore issues that we feel so curious about, but like me, barely know what we don't know. So thank you for helping bring us along. Thank you.
Such a pleasure. Have a nice weekend, everyone.